There's trouble at sea, and scientists are sounding the alarm that a core ocean current could collapse. Researchers have been battling to work out what could happen and when. But the truth is that despite the headlines, we still don't know what the risks are. And given that a collapse could have huge consequences for weather across the world, we'd really like to know. So what is the latest research showing us, and what can we do to protect ourselves from the seas running amok? I'm Adam, a climate scientist with a PhD from Oxford, sharing what you need to know about climate change. And one of scientists' biggest climate fears is a shutdown of the AMOC. I mean, it's even the plot of the ridiculous movie The Day After Tomorrow, although, spoiler alert, a real-life shutdown of the AMOC wouldn't involve Jake Gyllenhaal literally being chased by the cold. But anyway, AMOC is short for Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and basically what all that means is this is the Atlantic chunk of the world's vast ocean conveyor belt. To give a sense of just how vast this conveyor is, it would take a blob of water around 1,000 years to travel the length of it. The AMOC moves heat around the globe, and I am talking about a lot of heat. About 1 million power plants worth of heat energy are brought northwards by this immense ocean current. This huge flow is driven in part by heavy salty water sinking in the North Atlantic, but the whole process could get disrupted by fresh water. If a whole bunch of lighter, fresher water were added right at this crucial sinking spot, that could slow the entire current down. And when I say if, that's unfortunately exactly what's happening. One of scientists' main concerns is Greenland. By heating the planet up, we're melting the Greenland ice sheet, and that's dumping huge amounts of fresh water into the North Atlantic. And if this slowed down the AMOC too much, researchers are worried it could suddenly switch off, collapsing to a much smaller flow. Shutting down the transport of all this water and heat through the world's oceans would have huge consequences for the world's weather, which means huge consequences for all of us. We're talking about things like a sudden chilling of northern Europe, disruptions to the tropical rain belts, and a surge in sea levels on the east coast of North America. And all of this would impact where and how we can live and grow our food. An AMOC collapse is an example of what climate scientists call a tipping point, a sudden shift to a different kind of climate for our planet. And the thing about tipping points is they're not just sudden, they're also hard to reverse. So if the AMOC did suddenly collapse and then we were somehow able to reverse global warming, that wouldn't just switch the AMOC back on. It's a bit like getting a dramatic new haircut. Even if you really miss your hair afterwards, you can't just get it uncut, and getting back to where you started will take huge amounts of work. Now, none of this is just hypothetical, neither the deep haircut regret nor the stuff about the AMOC. In fact, climate scientists think the AMOC has collapsed before, most recently as the Earth was leaving the last ice age. In fact, I made a whole video all about the last 1 million years of climate change, which discusses this potential collapse. You can check that out over here. Okay, now before I get to what climate scientists think is happening to the AMOC now, I need to clear up one thing. You're going to see plenty of headlines like these saying that the Gulf Stream could collapse, and that is just not true. The AMOC does contribute a bit to the Gulf Stream, this current flowing up the east coast of North America, but a shutdown of the AMOC does not mean a shutdown of the Gulf Stream. Okay, but what about an AMOC shutdown? The big question is, could this happen? And if so, when would it happen? Well, the short answer is we don't know. And the long answer is Well, this whole video is the long answer. So the biggest thing you need to know about what we know about the AMOC is that we don't know as much as we'd like to know about the AMOC. In fact, we've only been directly observing it since 2004, which technically means our observations of the AMOC are Gen Z, and just as confusing for millennial climate scientists like myself to understand. There's just so much going on with it that it's hard for us to work out what the trends are. That analogy actually works quite well. While some lines of evidence suggest the AMOC is already slowing down, others imply we can't tell yet, but we can't rule out a slowdown. That said, the science generally agrees that global warming will slow down the AMOC this century. So back to that question, could we hit a tipping point, and if so, when? Well, for a long time, climate scientists have figured that a shutdown this century would be a high-impact, low-probability event. Climate scientists talk for unlikely to happen, but really serious if it did. But the more we've studied it, the less confident we can be ruling it out before 2100. And now a study has been published that tries to pin down the date. Let's talk about what the study says first, and then about what it actually means. So the study is called Warning of a Forthcoming Collapse of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. And I'm not exaggerating when I say I can't think of a more panic-inducing title to a paper that I have ever read. I mean, whatever the context, the words warning of a forthcoming collapse are hardly a cheerful way of starting a sentence. And the study doesn't get more cheerful from there. Ultimately, it predicts that the AMOC could collapse sometime between 2025 and 2095 if we stay on our current fossil fuel burning path. And let's be honest, this would suck. But we shouldn't assume that this result is true, because this study had some important limitations. What they did is look at patterns in the measurement of the AMOC to see if these patterns looked like they were approaching a tipping point. But remember when I said we've only actually been measuring the AMOC for like 19 years? So the researchers didn't actually look at measurements of the AMOC directly, instead looking at the temperature of the sea's surface as a kind of indirect measurement of the circulation. So the study could easily be missing what's actually been happening to the AMOC all this time. And given how hard it is for us to be sure what's been happening to the AMOC over the past few decades, we should be cautious about any predictions of what's going to happen over the next century. But as the scientists behind the study put it themselves, even with these reservations, this is indeed a worrisome result. And in case you don't read scientific papers all that often, worrisome is about as close to a full-on expletive as you're ever likely to find. Let's put it this way. We used to be confident that the AMOC wouldn't collapse anytime soon, but studies like this are challenging that. It's not like we now know it's going to happen soon, but we know we can't rule it out. And given how devastating the consequences would be for the entire world, we'd really like to rule it out. If you're watching all of this and you're feeling pretty scared because of this new study, well, I feel you. But know this. Everything we know about the AMOC points to the fact that we also know what we need to do to reduce the risks of a collapse. And so let's talk about what we need to do. The first and most obvious thing that we need to do is observe the AMOC as closely as possible so that we can be sure if or when it could collapse. This could provide us with vital time to prepare to adapt to the dramatic changes. Some scientists have even suggested that we could do some kind of geoengineering, where we'd kind of try and hack the climate to stop the AMOC collapse from happening. Although it's important to mention that many scientists are extremely skeptical about these ideas and are worried that they could do more harm than good. The second thing we can do is also pretty obvious. Stop doing the thing that is causing the problem in the first place. The slowdown of the AMOC would be caused by the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, which is caused by the heating of the planet, which is caused by the emission of greenhouse gases, which is caused by the burning of fossil fuels. So how about we stop burning fossil fuels as quickly as possible? The world has already begun the transition away from fossil fuels, and we need to rapidly ramp up that transition. And if you're feeling helpless, know that there are ways that you can meaningfully help. You can push for the structural changes that we need from the top. You can take steps to lower your own emissions, especially important if you're relatively wealthy or you live in a relatively wealthy country. And you can amplify the issue by starting conversations about climate change. If you want to make a start, here's 5 concrete things you can do about climate change without looking away from this screen. Okay, until next time, bye.